Hi guys, the title of the title you see on the screen today. Don't forget to like and subscribe and we'll get started.
This story is about a girl named Lila who was born into the Count Fairy family. Her childhood was completely uneventful. However, after her dear mother died of illness and it was discovered that Lila had no gift, circumstances took a completely different turn. The Earl Fairy family is a very unusual family. People are born into it with a special gift of healing. However, Lila somehow failed to inherit the gift. In order not to lose his inheritance, her father found a second wife. This was the woman who had become Lila's stepmother. She was of low status, but also had a slight predisposition to healing and was trying to gain more power by crossbreeding blood. And thus the girl had two older half-brothers. One was named Daler, and he also had the power of healing. And the other one was Toby, who was capable of real magic. And after that, there was another girl. This child was Emma, who was the daughter of Lila's father and stepmother. She was born with her own gift. And Lila, in turn, became an unwanted child for the family, so that her position became even lower than that of a servant. Her brothers and sister treated her like a doll to be abused, and her father and stepmother didn't pay much attention to it. Although magic existed in the world, only a few people possessed it, and the brothers and sister were the elite among all the possessors. The stepmother eventually passed away early as well. However, the abuse by the father and stepchildren did not stop. Lila was given so little food that it was not enough for her body to grow and develop normally. The clothes she wore were the clothes of her former maids. They didn't fit her at all and were always in danger of tearing into small pieces. Lila was frankly living her life at the bottom of existence. However, at the age of 12, one fateful encounter suddenly occurred. A grown man appeared in front of her, a mask on his face, and he was coming straight for her. Lila became frantically curious as to who he was. And when the man approached, he apologized to the lady and said that he had just gone out into the garden and had lost sight of the entrance to the mansion. So the stranger asked how he could get there, and the girl was speechless. The fact that this man called her, upcoming in such an unassuming guise, a lady, made her heart beat incredibly fast. After a while, she finally came to her senses, and, taking the wreath she had woven from the flowers in her hands, inquired if it was true that he was their guest. Afterward, she shrugged off the dirt on her clothes and said she could walk him straight to the mansion. The man immediately thanked her for it. Then she threw the wreath away, and the man noticed it. He came up to it and, taking it in his hands, put it on her head, saying that she had forgotten about it. Lila was trembling with happiness, because he was treating her so affectionately, and this had not happened in a long time. She even had a thought in her head, as if she had turned out to be a princess from a fairy tale she read all the time and imagined herself in her place. As they walked on, the man immediately asked her what her name was. Lila immediately gave her first and last name. And the guy, upon hearing that she was of the fairy family, was very surprised and even confused for a while. Lila then immediately, turning to him, apologized and asked if she could get his name. The man immediately came to his senses and said his name was Aaron Stanley. After that, they went on their way. As soon as she heard it, she immediately started thinking that his name was incredibly beautiful, and his voice was just adorable. She wondered if he was a serviceman, for he looked a rather stout man, so suggested that he must be on their estate by acquaintance with his father. They walked a little further. Then Lila stopped at the entrance and said that he was there. Then she asked if he would be satisfied if she would only walk him to this place. The man, smiling, immediately thanked her and told her that she had helped him out a lot and that he was very glad he had met her. Lila looked at him and immediately thought that she was the one who should be thanking him for such a happy moment in her life. But she realized that it was better not to say such a thing. For a while longer he stared at her, and afterward he asked Miss Lila if she was afraid of him. The girl, on hearing this, was puzzled and said that of course she was not afraid of him, for she did not see why she should be. Aaron then said with a smile that she was a kind person after all, and added that he hoped he would be able to meet her again. She immediately began to glow with joy and said that she too was very hopeful and wanted to meet him again. Then he went to the door and, with a last glance at it, went inside after all. At that moment, however, several people suddenly approached her from behind. They were silent for a while, and then one of them turned to Lila. He asked in a rough voice if she had made the wreath herself. As soon as the girl heard their names, she immediately realized who it was. And as soon as she turned back, she saw her brothers in front of her. Toby turned to her at once and told her that all she was allowed to do was pull weeds and listen to them. He then began to run closer to her and wondered how she even dared to make a wreath. The boy immediately threw the wreath off her head and said it didn't even suit her. The plants immediately began to fall apart and no longer held in the weave. And after the wreath fell to the ground, Toby even stomped on it a few times with his brother just to make sure it fell apart for good. When Lila saw this, she immediately ran up. She gathered up the remaining leaves and asked her brother to stop and not to do it. She began to cry, and her whole body was shaking. The girl covered her face with her hands so they wouldn't see it, but of course her brothers realized that she was crying. After that, they called her a complete idiot and started to leave, and Daler also said that this shabby wreath would suit her much better than a normal one. They immediately laughed, while Layla continued to lie on the ground crying. The man, who by then had not left but was standing there and had overheard their conversation, immediately became interested in the situation. In the end, absolutely everything in Layla's life screamed that she should never be happy. Mr. Aaron has not visited the fairy house since about 2 years ago. In fact, he is in one of the rooms talking to his father and Emma, most likely for the sake of his treatment. And Layla was a little worried about what they were talking about after all. But there were events going on that she was even more interested in. One day, after another meeting with his father, Aaron came out of his room and saw Layla. He wondered if she had been forced to do the weeding again. He immediately said he would help her without waiting for an answer. And Layla said it was no big deal because he certainly shouldn't get dirty, since she was used to this kind of work. But the man still insisted, and Layla then, smiling, said she'd rather he tell her something instead of help, because she'd like to hear about his accomplishments. She thought Mr. Arena was an incredibly kind man, for every time he came to the estate, he took the time to talk to her about various things. One day he asked if she was not afraid to listen to his stories, for they were sometimes really bloody. But the girl replied that not at all, for she found it interesting to hear about the military exploits he had accomplished on his own. In fact, their state, where Layla lived, had a hostile relationship with a neighboring state. From what she herself knew, Mr. Aaron had participated in combat every time it was required and had performed excellently. To be honest, Layla was really creepy hearing about the battles. However, she still enjoyed his stories. After a little thought, the man still said he should say that he was feared by his enemies as well as his own allies. Layla looked at him in surprise and asked why that was so, and at that moment he began to remove his mask that had been covering his face the whole time. And as soon as he did, he immediately looked at her, saying it was all because of the damn spot he had on his face. He was immediately embarrassed, so he quickly averted his gaze from her, for right between his eyes were some marks drawn in black, but they couldn't be erased. The girl was silent for a while, and afterward asked in a sad voice if it hurt by any chance. Aaron didn't say anything to that, but only wondered if she didn't feel dislike when she saw it. But Layla, smiling, replied that of course she didn't. Then he looked down again and wondered if she might be afraid. He also added that she could feel free to speak up because he understood. But Layla replied that she felt nothing of the sort, for he, Mr. Aaron, was a very kind man and deserved to be treated well. He put the mask back on his face and said that she was the one who should be called a kind person, not him. Layla, immediately smiling, thought of how incredibly polite Mr. Aaron was, since he talked to her so much and shared her most important experiences even. However, something eerie soon happened. It was the night of the same day after their conversation. She was walking down the hallway when she heard some strange voices outside the door. It sounded more like screaming. It was Emma's voice telling her father that she didn't want to heal this man. She was referring to Aaron, of course. The man tried to dissuade her and said that the Lord was visiting their house by order of the king himself, so there was no way they could refuse. Layla, on hearing the name of her acquaintance, immediately looked into the room and saw that Emma was incredibly angry and said that the man was wearing a creepy mask. She also added that she never under any circumstances wants to heal such scary and creepy people. In reality, healing was not an easy thing to do. Even though it could be done with a simple swipe of the hand, even with Emma's gift, it would be incredibly difficult to heal Mr. Arena's stain. The most effective way is to exchange body fluids, meaning you need to spend the night together. The father began to shout at his daughter and asked her to listen to him. Mr. Aaron came to see her personally by direct order of the king, and if she refused, their family's existence would probably be in great jeopardy. But Emma stood her ground and said she didn't want to be with someone so creepy and horrible. That's when Layla realized that the gentleman was visiting their home for the healing that Emma could give him and that he would be rebuffed. His kind treatment of her was too different from Emma's situation. It was only out of pity or to make a good impression on his sister through her. Emma continued to scream and said there was no way she would do that. If she was going to heal someone else, but not this horrible man. Without a doubt, Layla couldn't help but be saddened by this, so she ran away from there. The girl thought that if she had the gift that Emma had, she would be able to heal Mr. Arena. Perhaps then she would have gotten real kindness instead of pity and ingratiation from him. At the same time, poor Layla realized that she loved Mr. Arena despite the circumstances. She realized that it would be very painful, but she still wanted to be together with him, because she still wanted to see a kind person like him. In fact, when Layla's mother was dying, she asked if it was all a dream and things would get better very soon. But the woman then took her daughter's hand and asked that she listen to her well. Layla cried loudly and said she would listen to whatever she told her, so she asked that she not die in any way. Then Mother, looking at her, said that she was a flower that blooms when it loves and is loved itself. Until then, she remains a hard bud, and she is madly sorry that she has not loved as much as she ought. The woman then asked that Layla remember well that she was a bud that was sure to bloom someday. Layla, when she remembered these words, she didn't immediately understand why it suddenly appeared to her at this moment, because as a child, she hadn't even given these words much importance. Since that day, however, Mr. Aaron came to them again a week later and also sat for a while with Layla. Certainly she wished she could do something for him, for he remained as kind as ever. She wanted to do something kind for him, for he, even though Emma rejects him, still comes again and again. But to her great regret, the girl could only gather a bouquet for him. She hoped that these flowers might heal his heart a little. Before long, Layla, when she gathered a bouquet of flowers, immediately turned towards Mr. Aaron and started running towards him. But the girl did not notice the stone, which was in the grass, and fell heavily, crushing all the flowers she had collected. The man immediately got up from his seat and helped her up, and then asked if she was all right. He was really very worried about her health. When Layla looked down, she saw that there was blood on her lap due to the hard blow. Aaron smelled that blood at that moment, and there was only one thought in his mind. He must kill everyone, enemies and beyond. He immediately grabbed Layla by the throat and started choking her hard. Everything about him spoke of a curse, however he could not resist him. The girl gasped. She knew perfectly well that Mr. Aaron's true curse was in his heart, and the stain was only its visible manifestation. He looked at Layla with obsessive eyes and talked about killing her. The man was clearly out of his mind. Right at that moment, he was under the power of a curse. However, even in spite of all this, the man was crying, and when Layla noticed it, she realized that he was in great agony. Of course, if she had the power of healing, she would be able to save Mr. Arena, at least try to break even such a curse. She was incredibly sad and sorrowful that she could not heal her loved one. And in that moment, for the first time, she genuinely envied Emma, for she has the opportunity to heal Mr. Arena. But she has no intention of doing so. Layla thought about the fact that even though he was suffering so much, she must have had the power to heal him. At this point, the girl could no longer breathe, and so she began to cry. Then one of the tears hit his hand, and everything around him suddenly glowed for a while. And then Aaron finally let go of Lila. She immediately started coughing and trying to take deep breaths to get air into her lungs. The man sat across from her and stared in surprise. He knew exactly what he had done. So he turned to her and asked if she was all right. But at that moment, Layla suddenly turned to him and started laughing loudly and said that she was incredibly glad things had gotten better. He was still incredibly ashamed. He put his head down and began to apologize for what had happened. Layla immediately looked at him and told him not to apologize because she was fine and very happy that he was fine too. Aaron began to wipe the tears from her face and didn't understand how this was even possible. He sat down on the grass and wondered why she was being so nice to him. The man couldn't even look her in the face, so he lowered his head and asked why she was treating him like that when he was trying to hurt her and take her life. Layla, hearing this, immediately realized that his voice was shaking very badly, which meant that he was about to cry. It made her feel very sad. Then he added that he was cursed and hated himself the most for it. During this time, Aaron decided to distance himself from all humans so that he would not harm anyone until the curse was lifted. And despite all that, he still ended up taking advantage of her kindness. At that moment, Layla gathered up the flowers she had dropped and held out a whole bouquet for him, smiling. However, he put his head down and said that he had better not see her from now on. When she heard this, she was very frightened and immediately said that she did not want that. Layla replied that she was not hurt and therefore asks that he not speak in such a manner. Seeing his surprised look, she also said that she would feel incredibly lonely if she never saw him again. So she really asked him not to even say such a thing. Aaron's hands began to tremble, and he said she was the one he didn't want to hurt the most. Layla smiled at that moment, but thought that he was saying all this out of pity. But pity is despised by everyone in the house, and kindness is something she values. She thought again that it was all because she liked him. She thought again that it was because she liked him. Aaron continued to stand with his head down and said that he was indeed incredibly sorry. However, he must do so for their well-being. From that moment on, Mr. Aaron never showed up at their house again, and Layla decided to hold this unrequited love in her heart for the rest of her life. 2 years had passed since then, and the girl had grown up quite a bit, but she was still working. And she still kept Mr. Aaron in her heart. Her brothers had also grown up rather quickly. And one day when she was working in the garden again, Toby came up to her and, turning to Layla, said that she was still good with weeds, even after all these years. Lately, Toby had been coming to her more often and alone to banter and taunt her. Then he suddenly, smiling, asked Layla if she had ever thought about wanting to live her life any other way. The girl, who was already ready for another insult hearing such questions, was very surprised and asked what he meant. Toby then said with a smile on his face to make her his mistress, for he was going to marry a daughter from a respectable family, and he would give her the right to be his mistress. Of course, the girl did not immediately realize what he meant, for she had no such thing in mind. But the moment he grabbed her arms and pulled her to the ground, she realized everything. Toby looked greedily at her body and said that it was a great waste, after all, to have such a glorious body treated only as a maid. He also said that he meant that he wanted to have that body and would be very happy if she gave her mutual consent. Layla, hearing all this, immediately began to break free from his tight grip and asked him to stop doing all this. However, Toby said that she had a very pretty face. All he had to do was report a charming spell on her and she would love him in no time. At this point, he started whispering something to make Layla fall in love with him, and the girl, hearing this, was very surprised. She knew perfectly well that she could not allow this to happen under any circumstances, for her heart belonged only to Aaron-san. And at that moment she thought of something that made her glow. Toby was distracted, unable to finish his curse and nearly blinded. The boy looked at Layla in surprise and asked how it was possible that the curse was reflected, and he also didn't realize what the light was in the first place. Layla, when she realized that nothing bad had happened, exhaled with relief and thought about how lucky she was this time. Her feelings for Aransan hadn't faded, which meant that the light in her soul was still burning. At that moment, the rest of the family came to them. Emma turned to her brother and said that she had seen a bright light that was somewhere among the trees. And once they got to where Lila and Toby were sitting, they were very surprised. Daler immediately turned to his brother and asked what had happened between them in the first place. Toby immediately pointed his finger at Layla and said that she had tried to seduce him. And the girl, hearing this, was very surprised and could not believe that he could really say that about her. But her brother took her by her clothes and started to lift her up, saying she had no right to do that. Daler started yelling loudly at Layla and said that she couldn't use magic, so she decided to body try, I guess, and also called her a slut. Layla immediately started to defend herself and said that she had done nothing wrong. However, of course, no one listened to her. Toby immediately turned to her with a smile on his face and asked her who said she would let him touch her breasts. She immediately said it was the ultimate lie and didn't understand why he was telling untruths about all of this. Emma, who continued to stand by, immediately laughed and said that apparently their sister had nothing to do but humiliate herself in front of men. Her brother shoved her on the grass and told her that if she wanted caresses so badly, it was better to go into prostitution, because there she would at least get something for it. Toby, laughing, said it would really be a job just right for a girl like her. Emma leaned over and laughed and said that she completely agreed with them, for a sister who had no powers had absolutely nothing to do in normal society. After that, they turned around and started to walk away, both of them immediately throwing her a baleful look before doing so, as if to warn her that they weren't done yet. Layla was horrified. She didn't understand what was going on at all and why she was being treated like this, because she didn't do anything to them at all. However, it was still very much a good thing. She considered the fact that she had not lost her senses at the thought of Mr. Arena, and it was her one treasure that she hoped would stay with her forever. However, she was greatly disturbed by the fact that she herself did not know what that light was then. And so a few more years passed from that moment, and one day she was standing with her relatives who had been gathered for another family gathering. Her father told her that a marriage proposal had come in, and the man was their partner, the Marquis. He also added that it was certainly quite strange that she was the choice. But they could not go against the Marquis. Since they are earls, it makes sense for them to be bound by ties of kinship to the Marquis, so she certainly doesn't have the freedom to refuse, and the decision won't be discussed. He also said he should be reimbursed for the favor he did her by bringing her up, so she can't even voice her opinion on it. Emma, hearing this, immediately laughed and said that she had heard that the partner was that ugly monster, even though he was a marquis. Also, smiling, she looked at Layla and said that it was after all a very good match for the pathetic sister, so nothing surprising. Layla turned to her father in surprise and wondered if the Marquis was really a monster, but he said nothing to that. He was indeed a very creepy and heartless man, which is why he was popularly nicknamed the Monster Marquis. Daler, sipping his tea, said he never thought Layla could marry, and then said there was a decent use for her after all. And his brother sighed heavily and said that she would serve as his toy anyway, and so she would always be useful to her husband. Layla was incredibly upset and thought about how she didn't care at all who it was, even if it was the actual monster. Forgetting about Mr. Arena and becoming a wife willy-nilly would be very difficult. However, she had no choice but to do so. Her father said that the Marquis would come for her in a week. He also said that the girl must be ready by herself and need not take anything with her. Emma laughed and said that she had nothing to take. Emma laughed, saying that she didn't have anything to take, and added that it was a good thing he hadn't told her to take anything, because then they would have wasted the money. Her father said lastly that he hoped she would be of some use to the Marquis. Layla didn't even argue with them and said she would do as they said. That's how she realized that her first love had finally come to an end. And a week later, that very monster, the Marquis, came to pick her up. The one she had prayed so long to meet. And this mysterious man turned out to be, of course, Mr. Aaron. As soon as he met Layla, he said he hadn't stopped waiting for this day in a very long time. The girl didn't even hold back and cried, thinking about the fact that she too had waited a very long time for the day when they could finally meet. Aaron, on one knee, kissed her hand and told her that throughout his life he would make her happy, because that's what he really wanted. In truth, she didn't really care whether it was pity or fawning over her. If she could be near Mr. Aaron, she would do anything. So, smiling, she said that of course she agreed to everything, and just glowed with joy. Emma, with her brothers standing nearby, said they looked really good for their ugly appearance together. But Daler looked angrily at his sister and asked her not to be so loud about it. He was a baron after all. Toby, who was standing nearby also smiling, said that this was an incredible pity. The Witcher, her, more than one woman could not be seduced. But Aaron, hearing all their talk, immediately looked angrily in the direction of the two brothers and sister, and they became frightened, realizing that they had said something foolish. At this point, he took Lila in his arms, and as he left, he said that was the end of it, and he was taking the girl away from them. Lila looked at the man and thought it was like a dream. She couldn't even imagine such events. Even if there is no mutual love in their marriage, even if it is an apology for that time, she can still love Mr. Aaron forever. After a while, they pulled up on his wagon to a rather large estate. She and the gentleman left the house of Fairy and made their way to his mansion, and to the girl's surprise, it was incredibly huge. However, despite its magnitude, she felt a wistful sadness. She also speculated that perhaps it was Mr. Arian's heart that had taken her as a wife. After a while, they got out of the wagon and went inside. The man held Layla's hand, and as soon as the girl was in the manor, she saw a multitude of maids who, lined up in a row, bowed to the master and said that they were very glad to see him back. Looking around, Layla noticed that this mansion was incredibly delightful and never ceased to amaze her with its luxury. The man, seeing her delighted expression, immediately said that from this day forward, her home was in this place, so she could be completely at ease and not worry about anything at all. Layla immediately looked at him and thanked him for all of this. And then she looked away and saw a strange thing in a frame. She asked Mr. Areen what it was. The man explained that it was a sword honored by the king. She came closer and began to examine this weapon, which was placed in a special frame, and said that it was simply marvelous, for she had never seen anything like it before. Still, she knew that there was no way that a man like Mr. Aaron, who had received an award from the king, would choose her as his wife. Pity, she thought, is in full play in him. So she has to try to make sure she doesn't get kicked out at least any time soon, because she'll just have nowhere to go. Then the man turned to a servant girl named Ada. She immediately bowed before them and began to introduce herself. The maid gave her name and told the girl that she would be looking after Layla from that day forward, and also added that the girl could contact her with any question. She stepped closer to Layla and told her that her full name was Ada Dudley, and she would be very happy to work with her. Layla immediately gave her name and said she would be very pleased too. Aaron turned to Ada and asked if she could clean up Layla's appearance and apologized for this all being so sudden, and added that they would have lunch together afterwards. The maid immediately said that she would do as the master said, then asked that Layla follow her. The man glimpsed a glimpse of his future wife and saw that she had some consternation on her face. However, immediately afterward, she followed the maid. Immediately afterward, Layla was taken straight to the bathroom and began to wash her skin, hair, and nails very thoroughly. The girl was very uncomfortable about the whole thing. So, turning to the maid, she said she could wash herself, so they didn't have to do it. Ada replied that the landlord had told them to wash her daughters, tired down to the memory of her past residence. Layla, hearing this, was very surprised and asked what she was talking about in the first place. And the maid explained that she had heard that the girl had not even been provided with enough food and washing before. But that would certainly not be the case in this house. With a wink, she also told her that they would transform her so much that the master would even flinch in surprise. Layla had actually been dreaming of this all along, to become so beautiful that she could stand next to Mr. Aaron. But now she was no longer sure what she wanted, or whether that dream could come true at all. Several hours had passed since then, and the girl was finally ready. She stood in front of the mirror and couldn't believe it was her. And all because Layla was now stunningly beautiful, and the maids behind her were very pleased with their work. Ada, smiling, told the girl that the master had an eye after all, for she was very pretty. Layla then suddenly thought for a moment, and afterward said that it was the first time she was in such a beautiful outfit, and wondered if she looked strange in it, for she felt certainly unusual. Ada, smiling, immediately said that she could say it all the time. The mistress was incredibly beautiful, and also added that she should be confident and smile more often, for it suited her very well to smile. Layla immediately smiled lightly and wondered if she was talking about that smile. The maid immediately said that this was exactly what she meant. A smile makes a person far more beautiful than any makeup. After that, she said that now it was time for them to go to the master's house. Aaron was already in the dining room waiting for the girl. The first thing, the maids came into the room and addressed the master, saying that they had just brought Lady Layla to him. And as soon as the man turned his head, he saw a beautiful girl walk into the room, whom he didn't even immediately recognize. When Layla looked at his face, she saw an affectionate smile. However, he didn't even mention that she looked beautiful. And she understood that, because it was a marriage based on pity. But she was still a little sad about it, because he could tell that she had changed a little. Soon, Aaron clapped his hands twice, signaling to the maids that it was time to bring out the food, and the maids immediately began to bustle about, bringing out the various dishes. When the plates were in front of the man and the girl, he said he didn't know if it suited her taste. However, he had prepared a large variety so that at least something would please her. Layla, when she saw all these sumptuous salads and dishes, was very surprised, because she had never seen such things at home. And she was constantly left vegetable scraps from dishes that relatives cooked for themselves, so when she saw such food, she could not contain her admiration. After a while more they began to eat, and the maids kept bringing out new dishes. Their dinner table ended up with fish and meat and incredibly soft and flavorful bread. Layla couldn't remember ever eating food this good in her entire life. She was pretty sure that Mr. Aaron also knew that she had never tasted food like this, which was why he had decided to set such a large table. After she had emptied a few plates, the maids immediately began to pick them up and take them away. She remembered that she didn't even have to clean up after herself. Because of the amount of work she had to do, she couldn't really relax, because she was used to being under tension all the time. She also thought about her appearance and couldn't understand why Mr. Aaron didn't say anything. She was even nervous because they were sitting there silent. After a while, the man looked at her eating and noticed that her hand was shaking a little. So turning to the girl, he said he had a question about their ceremony. Layla was very surprised when she heard this. She had completely forgotten about the ceremony that was to take place. However, Aaron said that he was going to announce the marriage to the king, then have the ceremony at their mansion. So he apologized for that and asked if she could wait a little longer. Layla was very surprised and could not believe that he was really saying those words. She had never imagined that it would be such a perfect marriage, with a real ceremony and all the official events. She didn't even think that she could really afford something like this, and it made fear appear on her face. Aaron, seeing this, immediately turned to her and asked if there was anything wrong. But the girl looked away and replied that there was nothing wrong. She was only worried about whether she was fit for all this. But he tried to reassure her and told her that there was nothing to worry about because she had officially become his wife, so all the formalities had been completed. Layla still found it hard to believe that she was now his wife, so she wondered if it was true. He said that of course it was, and that it meant she couldn't go back to the Fae house now. He asked if she was okay with that, because it might make her uncomfortable. But the girl waved her head and thought that discontent was out of the question, certainly not about leaving home and living with Mr. Aaron. When he said that he wanted to ask her to wait a little longer as a continuation of the conversation, he then began to get up from the table and, turning to Ada, said that before morning everyone should leave the premises. The maid bowed and said that of course everything would be fulfilled. Then Aaron walked around the table to the other side and approached Layla. He held out his hand to her and told her it was time for them to go. The girl was a little surprised, for she didn't know where he wanted to take her, but of course she agreed. Soon they were walking down the corridor, and Layla realized that she was in Mr. Aaron's room. But she still wondered if it was right for her to be his wife, for there could have been many better candidates for the role. Aaron stepped closer to her and put his hands on her face, looking directly into the girl's eyes. In a quiet voice, he said that she was now his wife. He would not touch her, however, until the official ceremony was over. When Layla heard this, she was very surprised and didn't even respond. Aaron went on to say that he thought it would be a good idea to start a relationship after she was done. In fact, even though she was the kind of person you could treat any way you wanted, he still remained contentedly polite and manners with Layla. That made it even harder for her. In fact, she would like to be his right where he was. She liked Mr. Aaron, and even if that love wasn't mutual, she wanted to be with him as long as possible, to be useful to him. But Layla couldn't think of any way she could do that. She thought for a while about what might help him. Then she asked if he could hear her secret. When Aaron heard this, he was very surprised and asked what the secret was. The girl looked him straight in the eye and told him that she also had healing powers. Hearing this, he was very surprised and didn't even bother to hide the surprise on his face. He really couldn't believe that it was true. And Layla explained that there had been a day when Toby's brother had molested her, and then she had managed to fend off the spell he was about to cast on her. At that moment, an incredibly great power emanated from the girl. She also remembered the words of her dead mother, that Layla was a flower that would blossom when he loved and was loved himself. Therefore, the girl believes that the ability only blossomed because she loved Mr. Aaron with all her heart. When she ran her hand over the wounded area, a strange mark appeared on her chest. She'd seen it on Emma, and it was a healer's crest. If she hurt herself, somehow magically the pain disappeared in a flash and the wound healed immediately. After Layla wounded herself for testing and was able to heal the wound again, she concluded that she also had special powers. If she told the fairy family about it, they would certainly start using her for their own selfish purposes, so she kept quiet the whole time. When Aaron heard her, he was incredibly surprised. He wanted to say something to her, but she interrupted him. Layla said with confidence in her eyes that she would surely heal him, so he need not worry. Then the man came closer to her and began to hug her tightly and asked if she knew exactly how to heal him. He asked if she knew she had to make physical contact for his curse to go away. Layla replied that of course she knew that, and that was why she had told him her secret. Then Aaron said he heard her and understood. Then he took her in his arms and carried her to the bed. He then sat her on the edge and asked her if she was sure she was okay with all of this, because he would understand if she said no. But the girl said with a smile on her face that of course she didn't mind. Then he said that he realized he was forcing her to go so far, but he gave his word that he would be gentle in the process. He moved closer to her and started kissing her. They were very close that night, just like a married couple. Layla was well aware that it had happened many more times since that day. However, it was not for love, but for his healing. Even if it wasn't for his healing, she thought it was probably just simple sympathy. So she was doing absolutely everything she could to help him. One day, one afternoon, Aaron told everyone that he was leaving to visit His Majesty and would be back as late as nightfall. Layla, who with the rest of the servants had gone out to bid him farewell, said that they would wait for him, and afterward she came close to him. He looked at her in surprise and asked if she wanted something, and the girl asked him to buy her some flower seeds in the capital. When Aaron heard this, he was very surprised and wondered what she even needed them for. But the girl explained that flowers don't grow at all in the garden, so if it were possible, she would like to plant them to dilute that somber atmosphere there. After thinking about it, the man said that he certainly didn't need the flowers in this place. But now, since she lived in this place too, he would certainly look for them. Then he turned to Ada, who was also standing nearby, and asked her to contact the gardener. The maid bowed and said that of course everything would be done. Then Layla, smiling, thanked him and said that she really appreciated his care. And the man stroked her head and said that there was nothing wrong with it, and then went on his way. Lastly, Layla wished him a happy and orderly journey, and afterward in the bedroom began to tear the curtains. Ada, seeing this, immediately began to resent it and said, "Madam, she had absolutely no need to do such things." Layla then looked at her in surprise and said that she wanted the mansion to be a bright and comfortable place for Mr. Aaron. The place is very dark, so she has to do something about it. And she explained that she was going to change the curtains. This color is soothing, but makes even sunlight seem dark. The maid, hearing this, said that it was indeed so. The master did not care much about the decoration of his palace. Then Ada, bowing, said she understood, and offered to change the curtains in the whole house to the mistress's taste so that everything would be comfortable for her. Layla turned to her and inquired with a smile on her face if such a thing would upset the master, but the maid replied that there was no need to worry, for she would warn her master. She then went to the living room and said that she would have to order the curtains as soon as possible. Layla handed over the old ones at that moment and thanked her for it. But Ada said she was not to be thanked at all, for she also thought that the gardener should arrive very soon, and asked that the girl should give her the following directions. She said, smiling, that she could help with the work in the garden, and was also very happy to hear that she would be able to return to her usual work very soon. But the maid, upon hearing this, became very indignant and said that this was completely unworkable for mistress, so she shouldn't even say that. Then Layla laughed and thought that she was in a place like heaven. And after all, she had only recently been working in the garden, and changing the curtains would be her direct responsibility if she continued to live in her home. Soon the two of them were outside, and Layla immediately began handing out instructions to the gardeners. She said to have the trees trimmed so that no extra branches stick out, and if possible, to keep the shadows from falling on the mansion. And smiling, she also added that they would clean up the weeds together, for she wished the place was as bright as a meadow, and she would like to put a piece of her soul into making wishes come true. Ada, who continued to stand beside her, immediately started shouting and said that pulling weeds was not a job for a mistress, so she explicitly forbade her from doing it. The gardener was starting to get worried himself. He told the mistress that they could get on with it, and the girl had better just point. Oh, Layla suddenly became very sad and replied that she would be very uncomfortable just standing there watching them all work, and wondered if she was not allowed to touch anything at all. When all the servants heard this, they were incredibly surprised, for it was the first time they had seen a lady who wanted to work. Ada looked at the gardeners, and one of them waved his head. They'd let her do some work because they knew she wouldn't agree otherwise. Many hours had passed since then, and Aaron finally did return to the manor. He was immediately met by Ada, and with a heavy sigh, she said that they were stopping her. But Mrs. Layla still insisted on studying in the garden. The man was standing in the street, peering around the corner. He was surprised to see Layla there. And the maid said she ended up becoming very good friends with the gardeners, and they all got to work together quite quickly. The man smiled as he heard the whole story, and realized that of course she wouldn't have agreed otherwise. Ada also said in a worried voice that Layla said she wanted to make the mansion a bright and comfortable place for them, and she also added that she really hoped the man wouldn't be angry about it. Aaron turned around and started to walk away. He told the maid that he certainly wouldn't get mad about something like that. Just at that moment, the man approached Layla, who was busily working in the garden. The girl immediately bowed when she saw him and apologized for not meeting him right away. She said that she had just gotten carried away. Aaron stepped closer to her and told her that she could stop doing what she was doing. He added that he had invited her to his place so that she would no longer be tormented. When Layla heard this, she was incredibly surprised, but in a pleasant way, for she hadn't expected him to actually take her away from there so that she could finally get some rest. But afterwards she said she wished he would look at the flowers she had planted. The man was about to say something. However, she interrupted him, and taking his hands, said that she would be sure to grow flowers so that he would like it too. so she really asked him to look at it. Aaron thought about it for a while and then smiled and said that, in that case, he would agree and weave a special wreath of them. As soon as Lila heard that, she was immediately embarrassed. She couldn't believe that he still remembered what had happened so long ago. For it was when they first met, when she was still quite young, that she had the wine in her hands that the girl had woven. Then the man said that the seeds had already been prepared. They would be delivered very soon, so she had better leave the rest of the work to the gardeners and go and change. Of course, Lila didn't argue and agreed. She then thanked the gardeners for their labor and headed back to the estate. Meanwhile, other people were already working inside, hanging new light-colored curtains. Looking around, the girl noticed that the mansion was slowly beginning to brighten and the atmosphere was becoming much more pleasant. She also really hoped that Mr. Aaron would find the place bright and comfortable for both of them, so she thought. Some time passed from that moment, and one fine sunny morning a maid came in to see the girl. Ada, smiling, told Lila that her host had smiled much bigger and more often since the girl had arrived at the manor. When she heard this, she was very surprised and asked, "Is it really so? After all, I was very pleased to hear those words." The maid, for her part, said that it was certainly true, as one could often see his dejected expression in the dark room before. But it had softened a lot now. He looks at Layla very often with affection in his gaze and a smile on his face. Layla said she was very glad to hear that, and thought to herself that if it was as weak as Miss Ada said, they could be trusted. Mr. Aaron had saved her, and she wanted to repay him in any way she could, so she was doing her best. Also, the maid said that actually all the servants and gardeners had only become more cheerful and friendly after Madame's stay at the manor. And of course, Ada also added that she was incredibly happy to serve her. Layla smiled and said that she herself was incredibly happy to have the maid with her. She didn't know what would have happened if she hadn't been there. The maid also said that the master's temper is incredibly heavy, but she still asks her not to leave him alone because he needs support. Layla, smiling, said that she would definitely be with him, as long as Mr. Aaron himself was okay with it, because she was only happy about it. In fact, she only does it because it makes her happy. Being with the man she loves has been her dream all along, and now it has finally come true. Some more time passed from then on, and finally the day of their marriage ceremony arrived. As soon as Layla and the man were standing at the altar, the girl began to feel a little anxious. She turned to Mr. Aaron and asked him if it was okay that he hadn't invited a single guest. The man replied that it was all right. He didn't really have anyone to call, since he had withdrawn from everyone during that time. The man said that with the appearance of the curse, he became distant from all his surroundings, and now only people who are and work in the house communicate with him. Layla looked at him with a sad look and realized that it must be incredibly hard for him to go through all of this, which was also why the mansion was so lonely and gloomy. She took his hand and told him that he had her now and would have her forever, which she swore right before God. Aaron immediately smiled and suggested they begin the ceremony, for it would be the one that would bring them together even more. At that moment, the priest spoke and inquired if they vowed to be faithful and near in sickness and in health. Aaron looked at his beloved with a smile on his face and said that of course he would swear. Then the priest turned to Layla, and she also said that she agreed and swore to do all this. And at that moment, divine protection descended and blessed this beautiful couple with a happy future. The servants, when it finally happened, immediately began to applaud and congratulate them, and Ada couldn't even hold back her tears. After the vows were said, Layla kissed her lover and he pulled her as close to him as he could. The man then took her in his arms. When he did so, Layla looked at him in surprise and asked what he was doing. Aaron said nothing to this. He turned to Ada and said that he would leave the rest to her and asked her to release all the people before morning. The maid said she would do as he said. The man then took Layla straight to their bedroom. He slowly and gently placed her on the bed. The girl immediately became anxious because she didn't think it would happen so quickly. But the man, looking her straight in the eye, said she was so beautiful that it seemed as if he wouldn't be able to control and contain himself. Layla was a little embarrassed when she heard those words. He'd never called her beautiful, and no one had ever complimented her in her life. The man began to move closer and closer to her and said in a low voice that she was now his and his alone. Layla immediately thought that she must be mistaken in thinking of romance, for surely he was referring to her gift. After all, if she really did belong to him in all these ways, she would be an incredibly happy person. And of course, in her opinion, it could never happen. The man kept smiling and asked if she would mind even if the sun was that high, and they did. So the girl began to cover her face with her hands and said that it made her very embarrassed and that her face was red with shame. But Aaron, as he approached her, suddenly laughed and said that when she was shy, she was still just as beautiful. Thus they became legally husband and wife, even if it was true that this marriage was based on sympathy. Layla was still incredibly happy. When Aaron received his wound, he was on his second battlefield. It was a neighboring country to the south, namely Dusa. Dusa targeted the fertile lands of their country, which was called Kayla. The king was still young and a few years older than Aaron, so the enemies wanted to take advantage of that. The man was on the battlefield, killing his enemies with a single blow. They asked him to spare them, but of course he did not listen to them. The nickname Monster, which was a reference to his brutality, came from one of these battles. However, due to subsequent events, the nickname Monster took on a completely different meaning. King, who was himself on the battlefield, suddenly did not see one woman who was a witch. This girl ran up to him and, seizing him by the hand, said that she must curse him. The king would see in everyone only enemies, and this would be his curse for the rest of his days. Aaron ran up in time to save his majesty from the woman. She had no time to finish the curse on the king, so it was transferred to the man. He put his sword right up to her chest and asked how dare she put a curse on the king himself. However, the sorceress said with a pleased expression on her face that in that case, Aaron would bear the curse instead of the king, since he had dared to stand up for him. The man said that in that case it was a very good thing, and he would pay for it with his life, and in the same second he stabbed her chest with his sword. This curse ended up being incredibly strong and passed on to Aaron rather quickly. The man felt the curse rush through his entire body, taking over his consciousness. The king went up to him and asked if he was all right. But the man started to run away and told his majesty to stay away from him, for he knew very well that this would not end well. Aaron grasped at the last signs of reason and distanced himself from the king. It was all he could do then. After that, he went around killing absolutely everyone, because his consciousness was clouded because of the blood. He killed not only his enemies, but also his allies. The man had only one thought in his mind. He must kill them all. Even though he knew it was wrong, he couldn't help himself. Afterward, he was rewarded for protecting the king by putting himself under a curse, but behind the scenes, he killed so many allies that the nickname Monster became widely known among everyone. He ended up all alone without a single ally by his side because he didn't want to put people in danger. After his wedding night with his beloved, he suddenly woke up terrified, for he had dreamed again how he was on the battlefield. Aaron looked to the side and saw Layla there. He stroked her head and he felt a little better. He didn't care at all that everyone had left him alone, for he only wanted to make Layla happy. That was important to him. The next morning, Layla went to the garden to water her flowers with the gardeners. The man sitting in his office heard her loud and cheerful laughter. Ada brought the man some tea and told him that he had changed a great deal since the mistress had come to the place. He looked at her in surprise and asked, "Does she really think so?" The maid smiled and said that of course she did. She also added that she hadn't had the chance to watch him smile before, but now he quite often does. Aaron immediately thought that, of course, there was no point in denying it. Maybe he really had changed a little since Layla had come into his life. Then he met her for the first time as he walked to the manor. She was certainly unkempt, but her violet eyes shone like gems. With her lovely voice like a tinkling bell, she was like a flower fairy to him. He could easily surmise that she was having a very difficult time in the fairy household. Aaron realized that her younger sister Emma, who had the gift of healing, wore a much better dress. while Layla was in her maid's garb. So the man concluded that she probably had no healing powers whatsoever. As a result, he had to beg the fairy family for healing while despising her himself. However, Layla was not at all intimidated by his mask, and she even listened to his various stories. This girl, in his opinion, was the complete opposite of Emma, who rejected him every time she saw him. But, of course, Aaron didn't resent her because of this, realizing that such an attitude was quite justified, because he was rejected by absolutely all people. But Layla was completely different, and she even talked about how she was very interested in listening to him. When he spent time with her, he felt much lighter on his heart. As a result, unbeknownst to him, Aaron was not coming to the fairy house for healing, but only to see Layla. So it could be said that his heart was healed around her, and he felt less lonely. Even though he wasn't the kind of person who would think of such a thing, it still seemed to him that something good could come out of it. Sometimes the man even thought that fate was just mocking him, because this kind of thing happens. His curse possesses him, and he can do nothing. That day when Layla hurt herself, and he felt the blood, it all reminded him of a battlefield. For there were also flowers scattered around, and everything changed at once. The blood caused the curse to activate, of course, and the man began to hear many different voices in his head, ordering him to kill the girl. He tried to resist them, but it was all useless, for he was not strong enough to resist it. So he began to strangle Layla. The curse possessed him absolutely completely. He saw Layla as the enemy of all people, and so he tried to strangle her, even though she had become very near and dear to him. Losing control of himself, he didn't stop until time ran out. It was only a matter of time before something happened then. It was truly agonizing. He wanted to stop the curse, wanted to do something to save Layla, but his body just wouldn't listen. He had lost his greatest hope. It was incredibly hard for him, and he was so sorry for what he was doing to Layla. But in that moment, a miracle no one expected happened. A drop of her tears hit his skin, and everything around him changed. His curse subsided. He immediately started apologizing to her, but he knew it couldn't end with just an apology. He thought about how he wanted to make it up to her. No, not even that. The way Layla kept smiling, despite having been through something like this, fascinated him. And in that moment, Aaron realized that he really liked her. He had actually fallen in love with this girl long before all this happened, but he just didn't want to admit his feelings because of the curse. He didn't want to let people get close to him that he could lose. He was going to make Layla happy, and he really regretted promising himself that. In fact, to the fairy family, the king had repeatedly put forward orders for his cure. However, Emma's unequivocal refusal deprived him of any reason to visit their home in the future. And then he decided that he would get Layla out of that awful house. He knew he had to do it. Aaron was sure that falling in love with someone like him was a waste of time for a man. However, he swore to himself that he would make her happy at least. Certainly the girl did not possess the gift of healing, but she was still the Count's daughter, and the man realized that if he was reasonable, he would not let her out of the house so easily. So Aaron decided to save her by choosing exactly the form of marriage so that the Marquis could get permission from the Earl for his daughter's hand in marriage. This did not cause any particular problems. The only thing is her special bloodline. There are many aristocrats who desire the blood of a person with a gift, so there might have been difficulties. So from time to time Aaron consulted with the king, laying a special foundation for a good result in the future. So badly did the man want to protect her that he was willing to go to any lengths. And in the end, he did manage to get Layla. He supposed it would be a nuisance for her to marry someone like him, someone who was celebrated as a monster. But he loved Layla with all his soul and wanted to make her happy, so he was ready to devote the rest of his life only to this girl. Of course, he couldn't dream of any mutual love. He just wished she would never suffer again. While everyone was dispersing, this girl was the only one who tried so hard to brighten his home. Her kindness charmed Aaron and never ceased to amaze him. He was well aware that she might not love him and would still continue to love her as a friend. That's why he made her his wife. When the man thought of all this, He even chuckled a little. Ada, who was still standing next to him, hearing this, was very surprised and wondered if he really laughed. The man looked at her with surprise. Then she realized her mistake and apologized, for she had shown too much emotion. Fixing her hair, she said that she could assume it was a laugh of happiness at the thought of mistress. She also added that it made her happy too. The man said nothing to this, continuing to drink his tea. He thought about how Layla had changed the curtains in the meantime and had started to actively work on the garden. Also, she would not calm down, and sometimes she would sweep the floors, and the maids, when they saw it, would immediately snatch the broom from her and say that it was their job and she should not do it. After the marriage, their very happy days together continued, and Aaron was truly happy over the years. The weather was quite clear that day, so Layla offered to have tea on the terrace. He was already seated and waiting for her. The girl came to him with a vase and flowers in it and said hello to Mr. Aaron. She was wearing a beautiful green dress that perfectly accentuated her hair and eye color. As soon as the girl approached him, she immediately set down the bouquet and apologized for acting like a child. However, the weather was incredibly beautiful, and her soul sang. Aaron, smiling, replied that there was nothing wrong with that, and he could understand her perfectly well. The girl immediately thanked him for that. After that, they began to drink tea. But suddenly there was a strong wind and the tablecloth began to fly in different directions. It was dark blue in color. Layla immediately started fixing her hair and said that the wind was very strong after all. Aaron, when he saw the combination of colors of her dress and tablecloth, could not understand what had occurred to him, for he had some strange, intrusive thoughts. The man in those cloths saw the color of the enemy flag of the Dusa country, and immediately the thought came into his mind that he was on the battlefield and had to defend himself. He realized that if he didn't kill the enemy, he would attack first. The man tried to suppress the impulse at that moment so that the curse would not take effect. It was all much stronger than he was, however, and he had the thought again that he should try to kill Layla. Then he quickly got up from the table, but he couldn't walk. Layla looked at him in surprise and asked what was going on. However, his eyes turned black as night. When he couldn't stop himself, he despaired. He ran to Layla again, grabbed her with one hand and began to lift her up, choking her. Layla tried to break free and kept turning to him, asking him to come to his senses, for she was dying again. Everyone who heard the noise began to calm the gentleman down and asked him to calm down. But the man only had the thought in his mind that those annoying enemies should also be killed. But first, of course, he had to deal with the enemy, namely, in his opinion, Layla. She resisted for a while longer, but then suddenly, to his surprise, her expression became completely different. Layla looked him straight in the face and smiled, even though she was in incredible pain. She couldn't breathe, tears streaming down her eyes. Aaron was very surprised that she had a look on her face as if she had resigned herself to being killed.